terms of degree and frequency, I think we're probably at a nadir in terms of how well we get along with each other broadly as a society, at least in recent history. Of course, there have been greater divisions in the past, but in terms of the sheer amount of divisions that exist amongst people, the fact that we can't seem to agree on anything, whatever the topic might be, we may not have reached rock bottom because rock bottom is kind of an infinite expanse, but we're pretty close, in the sense that, of course, we could go further and plummet into the abyss, but it's pretty bad now. This is markedly obvious. You just look at the political, social, cultural, everything landscape, and it's just blindingly clear that people don't get along. And it really begs the question as to whether or not we ever really did get along. Because usually what happens when you have these deep-seated divisions, a lot of it's political, a lot of it's cultural, and there are other divisions too, is that things that were always there come bubbling to the surface. It kind of reminds me of a situation that you might have been in your life, whether it's a family member, a close friend, maybe even a relationship, where you're getting along swimmingly and there's a fight between you and the person. And eventually the fight degenerates into you remembering all the bad things the other person did or the things that you don't like about the person and vice versa. And it just ends up in a bad way. And I think we see a lot of that manifesting currently in the current year. And each side, and it's very much a polarized side of sort of left versus right, although there are people in the middle like myself and others who really don't want to partake of any of it, to be perfectly honest. The loudest voices are the ones that are heard, and so it is very much a polarized left versus right, whether it comes to politics or culture. And each side can't stand the other side, seemingly for obvious reasons. But in all the discussion and debate about this topic, the current political and cultural climate, I very rarely hear the core difference between all the factions out there. And really, the core difference between people at the level of individuals, too. What is that difference? It's really about the core axioms that you have about the world. And these axioms can vary wildly. And like many different things, these axioms choose us. We don't choose them. A bit like interest, right? Your interests choose you. You don't choose your interests. And in general, it's always a deep mystery. Where do these things come from that animate us and move us and stir us to do things? Obviously, a combination of genes and environment, but that by itself doesn't really explain the nitty-gritty details. But suffice to say, people have different assumptions about the world, different axioms. And sometimes these axioms can be as minimal as you like a particular film or a novel, and somebody else doesn't, and somebody else is kind of meh about it, but doesn't particularly hate it. Random example, I've never read the book, but I know people that absolutely are obsessed with the film Clockwork Orange. And for the life of me, I don't really get it. I've never really been into Clockwork Orange. It's not my thing. And that's fine if they like it. And an example where I'm more meh on is Dune. A lot of people love the Frank Herbert series, of course. Science fiction. Dune. You have the films coming out now. People love Dune. I don't dislike Dune. It also doesn't stir me to emotion if I have such things to begin with. Ha ha ha. And the same applies actually to Lord of the Rings, which is okay in my humble opinion, but I think there are other fantasy things out there. It just so happens that in the genre, Tolkien has the OG position. But then I have other games, certain games and films, that people just don't relate to either. I mean, Last of the Samurai, for example, is one of my favorite films of all time. I don't really have favorites, but it's up there, and I can post factum reason and argue why that's the case for me. But again, at the end of the day, it's kind of like a feeling in the pit of your stomach, right? Of course, arguing about film is very different from arguing about politics or deep-seated cultural issues, I'll concede that. But ultimately, the origin of these things is all the same. It's mysterious to us. Why do we like certain things, and why do we not like certain things? And why do we think, for example, that abortion is a really important issue, and other people don't at all? Some people think immigration is an important issue one way or another, and some people are really focused on maximizing immigration, and other people are really focused on minimizing it. I'm not saying that these people, when it comes to their politics or cultural values or issues, don't have arguments for these things. It's just that all these arguments, invariably, are always some kind of post-factum, post-hoc rationalization, made to justify what they instinctually feel and what they gravitate towards naturally for reasons discuss. Combination of genes and environment, but ultimately mysterious in the nitty-gritty details. This also doesn't mean that the arguments people are making are necessarily bad, even if they are post hoc rationalizations. That's okay. But your fundamental principles, i.e. your fundamental axioms, the things that are mysterious to you, they just are there, may not allow you to be convinced by the argument or not. In fact, inasmuch as you're amenable to evidence and different types of arguments on any different position or in any given situation, your axioms will mediate how open-minded you are to looking at the quote-unquote new data set that is being presented. I was once in a conversation with a radical progressive, and I try to be fair-minded in as much as I can be, and she was convinced that she would be able to win me over to her side. So she instructed me to check out this series of films, purportedly documentaries. The title was Kill All the Brutes. I think it's a 3 or 4 part series. Long story short, I watched the first part for about an hour, and I got fixated on one particular issue that came up early, claiming that the European Crusades had their origins in so-called white supremacy. The Crusades, of course, were a religious conflict. It's very unlikely, based on my knowledge, and I have some knowledge of it, that white supremacy played a role in it whatsoever. And I told her that the Crusades were a religious conflict primarily, one about power too, but that the racial dynamics that she was asserting were there, may have been there to a certain degree, but not to the degree claimed in the film, and automatically she lost quote-unquote respect for me, because her axioms about the world are very different from mine. Why am I talking about all this to begin with? Well, the fact of the matter is, as just discussed, people don't get along, and they don't get along because their axioms don't align. What do you do in such a situation? Well, there is the old-fashioned, we can agree to disagree. I have some close friends, and certain positions they hold I think are untenable, or I just don't agree entirely. But it's about the overall picture, obviously, and so we can see past these differences, whether it's political or something else. It helps that I'm relatively easygoing about most positions. I'm pretty tolerant about all sorts of views. But that doesn't work anymore, generally speaking. Agree to disagree isn't really a thing, I think, anymore, except maybe in some archives back in the day. So what do you do in a situation where you can no longer agree to disagree? Well, you have embattled camps that refuse to budge 1 inch one way or another. At that point in time, you have to see that there's no possibility of reaching a consensus, and that you either continuously battle over the territory you're fighting over, in this case we're talking about political or cultural territory, so to speak, or you just cede the territory and move on to greener pastures and say, look, you can have this chunk of land and I'll have my chunk of land, and we won't interact because that's the best solution to the type of problems we have. And frankly speaking, I'm of the view that that probably is the only solution at this stage for the incredibly deep-seated and entrenched divisions that have torn a hole in the fabric of space-time in terms of our social interactions and society. Setting aside the lack of feasibility of doing such a thing, I think people need to look past the feasibility issue and just acknowledge that this solution, if you even want to call it one, is the only solution to all these problems. If people don't acknowledge that they're never going to get along because their differences are just too pronounced, then you find yourself in an eternal quagmire. What's the way out? Well, like I said, leaving the quagmire and disassociating with the faction that you happen to disagree with. I see no way past this at this stage of the game. And not many people talk about this. It's a shame. Maybe because of the feasibility issue I mentioned, but maybe because people just don't think about it. And even if they do think about it, they don't want to see the territory and just move on. They want to keep fighting. Anyway, when I look at the wasteland of the world right now, this is what I see. Intractable differences, no solutions in sight other than to part ways. And until people get that, nothing is going to change. In any event, thank you for tuning in. Many special thanks to my patrons on Patreon and my donors on PayPal. You guys are absolutely the best. You guys are essential for the channel. Without you, the channel could not exist. As for everybody else, if you can leave a like, comment, share, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, supposedly it helps, be much appreciated. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out next time. Until then, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.